stock market stuff?
Yeah, I did. I love how Bloomberg had to have a total guide to the Wall Street bets lingo that they use. Like they had to write tendies, chicken tenders, parentheses, profits. It's like diamond.
This is
diamond hands, hold securities at all costs.
To the moon. Stocks are going to go up. This is the world we're living in now, where
I love it.
Internet lingo defined for our politicians and all of that. But we're going to be talking about Texas winter blackouts, wind and solar energy, and maybe a little bit of Green New Deal. I don't know. We'll see what happens on episode 282 of the In the Tank podcast. As always, I'm your host, Donald Kendal, and joining me, I've got Jim Lakely, VP of the Heartland Institute. How are you, good sir?
I'm doing great. It's the 1-year anniversary of 15 days to stop the spread, so I hope you're all celebrating like me, but not wearing your mask while on the podcast.
Yeah. Nice. I think I'm going to go out and buy a bunch of toilet paper to celebrate that.
That's right. There's a ceremony. There's ceremonial things involved like Christmas. Yeah. Let's have a run on toilet paper now, and water, and milk, and eggs, and chicken. Apparently chicken. I remember in the stores, you couldn't find a whole chicken anywhere in my grocery store. It was ridiculous.
Yeah. Isaac Orr, policy fellow at the Center of the American Experiment. How are you, good sir?
I'm good. Thanks for asking, Donald.
You're very welcome. Okay, so this being a Heartland podcast and energy policy being a primary topic that we cover, naturally we're going to talk about the recent storms in Texas and the resulting power outages and everything that's going on over there. So we are being joined by a guest, Brent Bennett, Policy Director for Life Powered, an initiative of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. How are you, good sir?
Doing all right so far. Still have power in the condo, so it looks like more people are getting their power back finally. So.
Yeah, well, I want to do a deep dive into this. We got all hour planned for this. So we asked you to come on to the show for a number of reasons. That number is 2. Reason 1, you hail from Texas. And reason 2 is your focus is primarily on energy topics. Am I correct so far? Oh, man, a little bit of a delay here.
Little lag there. Maybe some ice on the wires outside.
Oh, there we go.
That's all right.
We'll make Andy fix that in post.
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, maybe. All right. So tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe TPPF.
Yeah. So Life Powered is, as you said, a project of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. We're kind of the energy policy arm. We exist to raise and manage America's energy IQ. We're both we both promote policies and drive legislation, but also educate the public about energy. So that's the latter part is what I'm here to do today, and I'm glad to be with y'all. Myself, I'm a native Texan, born in Midland in the heart of the oil patch. Got my PhD at UT in materials science. Specifically, I built batteries for wind and solar, storing wind and solar. So I was researching big batteries. Did a detour into finance for a while, and then now I'm back in energy doing energy policy. Basically because I didn't want to leave Texas. I had some opportunities outside of Texas, but I said, well, I'm going to try some different things rather than move. So
all right.
Here we are, an engineer doing policy.
Nice, very nice. Well, I think I don't know. Everything is seemingly coming to a head for you here in the past couple of weeks with this crazy weather going on in Texas. So I guess first things to start with is just kind of like the overall narrative that have been going on, because it seems like all the time news breaks that we want to talk about the day after we record a podcast, and this was pretty similar. I mean, the winter storms in Texas and all that happened in the weekend just after we recorded our latest episode. So like the story in itself is already kind of like a week old, but the story is kind of shifting. So in the first couple of days, like I think over the weekend and maybe even into Monday, the big story was like all these winter storms ravishing Texas, freezing the wind turbines, and that's leading to all of these power outages. But then the story started to shift, and the blame started going from the frozen wind turbines to everything else. Everything else that has to do with the Texas electricity grid. So maybe you could just kind of give us a little primer on just like kind of what happened over this weekend and into this week.
Yeah, well, I think there's kind of three ways that we can maybe break down the show a little bit. One is what has happened specifically this week. Number two is what caused these things to happen in terms of in the longer, broader picture of things. And three is what do we need to do to fix it and keep it
You're
from
reading
happening.
my mind, man. You're reading my mind.
Oh, wow.
So we'll start with number one here. So first of all,
mind reader, Brent Bennett.
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I'll cut out. I'll knock it off.
Yeah. So first of all, there's a narrative that a lot of this happened because stuff broke. Both wind turbines and natural gas generation, you name it. It's like, well, stuff is breaking. But really, this was almost an inevitable consequence of not having enough capacity. I actually wrote, and myself and an advisor that we work with wrote to internally on Friday, and we said, we were looking at the forecast, and we said, man, we're going to have blackouts on Monday. Like, there is no way that we have enough capacity to meet the demand that's coming. And with the wind generation basically going to zero.
Oh.
Am I there?
You're breaking through. We can keep it going. You're saying that you're basically predicting that there's going to be blackouts.
Yeah, I can. I could show you the email chain Friday night. We said there's, the forecasts were clearly showing it. The thing that surprised us was that we thought that it was going to happen either early Monday morning, like around 8 a.m. Monday morning, or 8 p.m. Monday night, because those are when the peaks during cold winter days are. Is early in the morning and late at night. And wind generation was kind of going to decline steadily throughout the day on Monday. So we thought that if it didn't happen Monday morning, that it would definitely happen by Monday night. I mean, we were absolutely certain it was going to happen Monday night. It ended up happening at about 1 to 2 a.m. Early Monday morning. And we think the reason for that is that there were actually a few failures of some power plants. Certainly not the 30 gigawatts of failures that they keep reporting, right? It was probably just a couple, because that's all it took at that point. We were walking the tightrope with less than 2,000 megawatts of reserves on Sunday night. And so all it took was a couple of failures to send things over the edge. And so what we think happened is that those failures caught ERCOT off guard. And ERCOT being the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, of course, that manages our grid. They manage the market for our grid. And so they're in the same thing as MISO up there in the Midwest. So it caught them off guard, and they failed to institute rolling blackouts soon enough. So by not cutting demand soon enough, the grid frequency, which is supposed to be stable, right? You're running a grid. You have to keep the frequency and the voltage stable so that there is, always power on the lines, so that all the generators can be running and continuously turning, right? And if you get that frequency too low and there's not enough there in the grid, then generators automatically have to trip offline. We call it tripping, because they're operating at a different frequency than the grid, and they're going to damage their equipment if they continue to run. So they have to trip offline to keep from destroying their equipment.
Wow.
And so we think that's the source of the vast majority of the 30 gigawatts that went offline. Even part of a nuclear plant went offline. And then a lot of those, a lot of the reports about stuff freezing came after that. It came, because the temperatures didn't get into their coldest points until Monday morning and then Monday night. And when stuff we didn't have electricity to run some gas compressors. We didn't have, some gas pipelines had problems. A lot of infrastructure out in West Texas was accidentally turned offline. You know, so a lot of mistakes that led to a lot of gas infrastructure going down, which made it harder to get the plants back up. And that's why we've seen this prolonged time of not having you know, these power plants come back online.
So this is,
you know, and if you don't have, and when plants have to shut down, it takes a long time to wind them back up again, right?
So, I mean, like I've read a few articles that are written by policy experts at TPPF, and it seems like in the past that they were concerned about this type of thing happening. You know, increased demand for energy mixed with unstable, you know, unreliable energy being put out by wind and solar. But it seems like the biggest concern was that something like this would happen in the summer. So it's just kind of like like this. You know, unexpected snow and cold that brought it on? Like, was this is like a very unexpected thing to happen in Texas, huh?
Yeah, I mean, we've been predicting shortages for a long time. I mean, at least the couple years that I've been in this line of work. And the thing is, like you said, we expect it to come in the summer because we know during the summer that that's when we get our highest demand periods. And we know that if you coincide that with low wind and solar output, then you could easily get a blackout. Yeah, it was just unexpected that we would get this much demand in the wintertime. I mean, we exceeded our previous winter demand record by something almost 10%, and we were going to exceed it by more than 15%. By the time Monday night rolled around, if we hadn't had the blackout start beforehand. Right. So this is unprecedented in a certain sense, but it's also the shortages were entirely predictable, and we've been saying that for a long time.
So it seems like there was
it's one thing to blame it on the weather, but it's you know, on the one hand, yeah, you could blame that it happened now on the weather, but it was inevitable that it was going to happen at some point. We've retired. We've actually retired more gas and coal than we've built in the last 5 years. Even as electricity demand is going up in Texas, and we've relied entirely upon wind and solar to meet our demand growth. And so if that wind and solar doesn't show up, which it didn't, you know, and it doesn't when you really need it, here we are. It's an inevitable consequence.
You know, there was a story that was happening in Texas, I don't know, maybe a week ago, where it was just like a 100-car pileup, you know, or something like that on one of the highways near Fort Worth, I think. And a family member of mine kind of like asked about that. It's just like, you know, what, like, you know, Texas people can't like drive in the snow or something like that. And my answer to that was like, well, they're probably not as prepared to get salt on the roads like we are up here, you know, like. And I'm just kind of wondering if like that same type of mentality can be applied to this, where it's just the hardware that's producing this energy is just not prepared for this type of weather. I mean, is that kind of what instigated all of this?
A little bit, but not much. You know, we did have an event back in 2011 that was somewhat similar to this, and you know, we had not quite this low temperatures, but pretty low temperatures for several days. And we had some rolling blackouts during that time. And after that time, there was a fair amount of investment in you know, weatherization, insulating, and so on. And there can definitely be some more of that. There are a lot of, you know, a lot of people, you know, a lot of infrastructure that's not well prepared. But I think, again, that kind of obscures the point that this was inevitable. I mean, if none of the wind turbines froze, if we had all of our thermal generation running full tilt, even if we had a fair number of planned outages, so we had a lot of, you know, we have planned maintenance outages during the off-peak times of the year, right? Normally, this is not a peak time of the year for demand, right? So there were some planned maintenance outages that had been in place, the plants that were off for the entire month, right? Even if those plants had been online, we probably would have still been in the hole by the time we got to Monday night, because the wind was going to basically zero. You don't have any solar at night, and we didn't have enough reliable capacity to meet the level of demand that we were going to see. So So again, the failures kind of made it worse. The fact that we didn't have, proper weatherization, the fact that we didn't start the rolling blackouts soon enough, and so on and so forth. It made it worse than it had to be, but it was inevitable that we were going to have blackouts because we didn't have enough capacity. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So how are people kind of like managing, down in Texas right now? I mean, is this blackout stuff still
Not
going
well.
on? Right. Like,
yeah, we're I think by the end of today, they're forecasting that we'll have most of the power back online. But now we're having water pipes freeze. So like I don't have any water in my condo. There's a water main that broke down the street, and a big one that broke downtown. I live near downtown Austin. So now that's the problem is water infrastructure.
right.
So we'll see. Hopefully by the end of the weekend, most things will be back to normal. But
I was talking
yeah,
with
it's pretty wild.
I was talking with a friend of mine who was saying that they spent a lot of winters further up north, and where they can just count on like routinely having power outages, whether it's trees falling down on power lines or something like that in the heart of the winter. But they were prepared for that. They would expect that, generally speaking, like when the winter months come. So I'm wondering, like in Texas, when something like this happens, like is it just chaos? Like I don't even know. Like what?
Yeah.
Did it turn into Mad Max down there? Like what? Like paint the picture a little bit.
I don't know about Mad Max, but yeah, I mean, you can look and go online and find pictures of, massive lines outside the grocery stores because not a lot of places are open. Some places don't have power, some places don't have water. Like I said, the Chick-fil-A down the street from us has a line that's about 4 or 5 blocks long stretching behind it because it's the only place that's open. It's pretty ridiculous.
Wow.
I mean, we're going to have to figure out after I'm done with this podcast, we're going to have to go figure out where the heck we can get some food because we're almost out ourselves. Even though I knew that by Friday that we were going to have blackouts, I didn't exactly prepare us very well either. Right. So, I mean, it's not in the mindset of Texans to have, a bunch of food stored up in the wintertime and to, just and to be ready for icy roads. I mean, you mentioned the crashes up in Fort Worth. Yeah. I mean, there were crashes everywhere. I mean, that happens. Part of it is that we don't have the preparation for,
Wow.
snowy roads. And part of it is Texans are not good drivers. I say that as we are just not very good drivers. I mean, having lived in Oklahoma where we got storms like this every single year, people there handle it a lot better.
Wow. I do want to change turn the subject towards just kind of how we got to this point in Texas. But Jim or Isaac, do you want to hop in with anything before I kind of pivot that way?
Yeah. So this is something for my own, curiosity, I guess. But when you talk about the fact that the power plant's tripped, right? Would it be fair to say that's kind of like a circuit breaker in your house breaking when you have too much demand on that circuit in order to, prevent broader damage to the wiring in your house?
Yeah, it's pretty close to that. That's probably that's the best analogy that we've come up with.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, the difference there is, your wires in your house are static, right? And they're just they're designed to handle a certain amount of current, right? And if you get too much, then they'll fry. The difference with a generator in a power plant is that generator is operating, right? And so you have to take it offline in order to prevent it from. In this case, it's the opposite, right? You're trying to pull too much current out, right? There's too much demand on the wires, and the generator can't supply that, right? So it is like a circuit breaker, but a little bit backwards.
Sure, got it.
Yeah.
We've been trying to come up with analogies, and that's the best one we can do. I need to get an electrical engineer, and I know some guys that have run power plants. I need to get one of them on the phone. They're all too busy right now, though.
Sure, I'll imagine. I have a question. It's you're familiar with Alex Epstein, I should say, at the
we've been in touch with Alex a lot this week, as you might imagine.
I'll bet. A great guy on energy policy. But he shared a chart, and I wish I sent it to Andy so he could put it on screen, but he can't. And maybe I'll be able to do that later. But it showed how it was just from the last week, and it showed how much wind and solar were contributing to the mega the electricity output of Texas, and it goes up and down. Of course, solar goes to nothing at night and comes up. So it was done by hours through the day. And then when the storm hit, just for lack of a better way to do this other than on the YouTube video here. So I put my fingers close together, and it was like this much natural gas was being used for the power grid. And then when the storm hit and all the wind turbines stopped spinning and the solar wasn't there it is. It went, the natural gas use quadrupled.
Good. I was about to pull it up myself.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. So that the quadruple. I mean, look at that. That's pretty amazing. So natural gas had to come in and fill the gap. And you notice there on like around the evening of February 15th, going into February 16th, that coal went down a little bit, and so did nuclear. And you mentioned this earlier in the podcast here as we were talking. We have nuke plants here in Illinois, and of course coal plants, and we don't have the problem that they are unreliable or really affected very much by the weather, and we get much worse winter weather up here in Illinois than you do down in Texas, by and large, and it lasts for a long, long time. I wonder if you could explain to me and to our listeners, why was it that even nuclear and coal plants, and to a certain extent natural gas plants, had trouble keeping that peak output capacity during that rough time there around the 15th of February?
Yeah, well, that's what I explained before, where these plants were tripped offline because there was more demand in the grid than there was supply, right? When you see that drop off at the top, that's when the blackout started, right? Okay. And that little drop just in the early morning of the 16th, right? And so because as Isaac and I were saying, there's not enough, the grid frequency dropped too low. There's too much demand on the grid and too much strain. The generators had to cut off line. So those coal and nuclear generators had to cut off line in order to save their equipment, basically.
So there was so much demand. There was so much demand. It was going to basically, for a non-energy expert, it was going to break it. It was going to break the plant. There's so much demand. And
I think we need to be very clear that none of these plants broke. This is not the fault of the power plants. This is a system problem, and the power plants shut off in order to protect themselves, so that they could then come back online later. Right.
Right.
Sure. How long does it take to get a plant like that back up? So if you have a coal or a nuclear plant, or a gas plant for that matter, that does trip offline, what's the process for getting that back up and running?
Man, that's a little outside my purview, but
okay, that's okay.
But basically, you have to get the generators spinning again, and you have to get them reconnected to the grid, right? So and that takes time, right? And you can't just re-energize the grid with just one power plant, right? You need things to come up in together, right?
Yeah, in sync.
In sync. When you have a total blackout, right, things have to come together in sync in order to energize the lines and get the power flowing, get things back up to the right frequency,
and
the right voltage, right? So that's the best explanation I can offer, but that takes time to do that. And then a bigger problem too is, like I said, there's a lot of infrastructure that after the blackout started, a lot of infrastructure had problems. So we have a lot of gas shortages. Gas plants can't get gas in order to come back online. Some things like that, right? So plants are a little more reliable just because they have to keep fuel stored on site, right?
Right.
Yeah.
In Texas, we don't really have a lot of on-site natural gas storage because we're pumping it from the ground, right out the back door, basically, right? Mm-hmm. But if some of that infrastructure freezes or your compressors don't work, then you can't get gas into the plant.
So would some of those compressor stations or pipelines not frozen? Would they have not frozen had some of this, I guess the tripping of the power plants, right? So if they had been able to maintain continuous power, I grew up on the same house my grandpa was born in, right? So it's a country house. When it got super cold out, we needed to leave the water running in order to keep the pipes from freezing. Is it kind of the same concept there? Would we have had less natural gas infrastructure freezing had the power not gone out, or is that not how it works?
My suspicion is that it's not so much that a lot of infrastructure froze; it's just that it didn't have power, right? So you need substations, you need pumps to keep the gas compressed, to run it through the pipelines, right? That all relies on electricity. And what we've heard is that the grid operator out in West Texas accidentally shut down a whole bunch of substations that were powering natural gas pipelines, and that cut the flow of natural gas from West Texas significantly. So, I mean, I think that by and large, when you talk about freezing, that is really what's happened, is that
Got it.
They just didn't have power. Now, there were definitely some cases where, I'm sure pipelines, froze or had issues because they weren't properly weatherized. But, by and large, that is not, to the best of our knowledge, that is not the cause of most of these problems. Most of the problems were caused by, just not having electricity.
Got it.
Yeah. So Steve Malloy is a member of the board of directors at the Heartland Institute, and does, you can follow him on Twitter at Junk Science. He's been all over this story. And he cracked to me in a text the other day that this is what you get when you have English lit majors setting energy policy in the state of Texas. And he was like, hey, Rick Perry doesn't get off with a free pass on this one. Neither does Greg Abbott. I mean, these are energy policies put in place in Texas that failed at the time when it was needed most. And I wonder, Brent, if you could, let's just say that exactly what happened this week in Texas and to the energy grid and the weather, that you could predict it down to the minute of what happened and everything that happened. What would have needed to be done in Texas to prevent all of this from happening? Because again, up here in Illinois and in the Dakotas and in Canada, for that matter, these sorts of things don't happen because they had prepared their energy structure to be able to handle this kind of weather. Again, this is a freak, maybe once every 50 years type of thing in Texas. But if you had perfect forethought, what should have been done to ensure that all Texans retained the power that they need in order to survive?
Yeah, well, that's definitely a question that's worth the last half hour of our conversation. You're right. I mean, fundamentally, this comes down to the policies from the legislature and the PUC, right? Everyone's blaming ERCOT right now and their mismanagement. But if ERCOT had done everything perfectly in the past week, we might have still probably wouldn't have had enough capacity, right? And that's what I was saying before. I mean, It was inevitable that we didn't have enough capacity. So if everything had been working perfectly, we wouldn't have had blackouts at 1 or 2 a.m. Monday morning. We would have had them either at 8 a.m. or at 8 p.m. when demand was going to be even higher and wind production was going to be even lower than it was Sunday night, right? So I think we've got to be very clear that ERCOT has made a lot of mistakes, but fundamentally the blame rests with the PUC, right? And to go a step further back from that, right? As I said, the reason we don't have enough capacity is because we've relied entirely upon wind and solar to meet our demand growth, right? Well, why have we done that? Well, because of the federal subsidies, primarily the production tax credit, that have incentivized wind and solar to be built, right? And so in Texas, whatever's cheapest gets built, right? We don't have any reliability requirements specifically, right, for generation to be hooked up to the grid. If you can provide power, you can be hooked up to the grid, right? So that tends to favor the lowest marginal cost producer, right? Well, when you have wind being subsidized to produce energy, that's the lowest marginal cost producer, right? And so that's all we've built and so fundamentally, this, if you were to identify a single policy cause of this entire thing, it's the production tax credit. And the fact that we've built so much wind in West Texas because of that tax credit. And so that's really what it boils down to.
Yeah, big market manipulation.
It's a distorted market, right? We don't have a free market, electricity market in Texas. It's distorted. Now there are also state subsidies at play as well, right? Now we have property tax abatements for energy projects in Texas, both oil and gas and renewables. Although renewables take a lot of them because they're heavy on property, right? They take up a lot of land, and that's They pay a lot of property taxes. So they use property tax abatements that we give them to the tune of over $1 billion a year. And we've also subsidized their transmission. In Texas, we have unregulated wholesale and retail markets, but the transmission lines, just like the roads, are paid for via socialized mechanism. We all pay a fee on our electricity bill for transmission lines. And so we've basically built the roads for the wind turbines to come in and provide their power to everyone, right? And they haven't had to pay for that at all. And that cost has been socialized. So they've basically been given a free run to produce in our market without any reliability constraint. There's no reliability requirement for them. So they're not penalized. They're not being penalized right now because the wind's not blowing hard enough, right? And so that's fundamentally, and that problem fundamentally rests with the PUC and the legislature who set the rules for the market, right? So in the first place, we wouldn't have this much wind in the first place if it wasn't for the production tax credit. That's the first cause, the primary cause. But the secondary cause that falls on our elected leaders in Texas is that we didn't do anything to ensure reliability, knowing that we had this much wind and solar coming onto our grid.
Well, there's always something about Texas that confounds me. Is we've done the show for several years. We talk about policy and all of that. And there's certain things about Texas, being like this red state, or the Lone Star state, always kind of threatening to secede, at the drop of the hat type of thing. But then they have like no school choice programs. And then, we're talking about how they've shut down a whole bunch of reliable energy, whether it's coal or I think even like a nuke plant was shut down. Maybe I'm wrong on that one. And then instead they've been building up all of these wind turbines. And you mentioned how like the market is totally manipulated and these perverse incentives that kind of get these things built in the first place. But I saw this article recently about Texas Governor Abbott recently received the Global Energy Wind Leadership Award for his commitment to wind development. So, I mean, like, what is it? Like, is it just kind of, these wild winds of the market and the market manipulation that's kind of bringing this on? Or is this like a concerted effort by politicians in Texas to bring up wind, whether it's virtue signaling or whatever?
Yeah, well, the more concerted effort to bring up wind was done about 15 years ago when we had both a renewable energy standard that was brought in that had, if my memory serves me right, it was about 15% renewable energy standard by 2020, about where we're at now. Of course, we're at 23% this year, right? And then also, like I said, the choice to build transmission lines out to the wind turbines. There was actually a program put in place by the legislature called Competitive Renewable Energy Zones that financed all the transmission lines that have brought the wind in from West Texas, right? So those are the two policy decisions that Texas lawmakers made to basically subsidize wind, right, specifically. And so that goes back kind of before Abbott. Frankly, Abbott just hasn't really done anything. He's just kind of let things roll. Right. And so the fact that he's getting awards is kind of like, well, you haven't attacked wind. So, and since we already set the conditions in place many years ago for this to happen, right, then since then the market has kind of taken over, right? We have the production tax credit combined with, which is a federal thing, combined with, the market access that we've given wind and that we've paid for. Not force them to pay for it, right? Mm-hmm. So that's basically set the conditions in place. So that's pretty much it.
So this organization goes to Abbott. They're like, we want to give you an award. He's like, who are you? Yeah, sure. Okay, I'll take it. That's basically what's happening here.
Yeah.
Well, Texas has bragged about being the largest wind producer in the country, and you guys are sitting on the best natural gas deposits, I think, on planet Earth. And as you said, you're just, you're getting that natural gas and you're shipping it out, not using it as much as you could. But it just seems to me that we're adding all of this wind as almost a virtue signal kind of thing. I mean, when you brag about being the country's biggest wind producer, and then when you really need the energy the most, it's completely useless. I don't see any real value that, maybe I'm being too cynical, but I don't really see any real value that wind, even operating relatively optimally, even does anything actually good for the power grid in Texas overall. Am I wrong? Is that too cynical? Is there some good to come from wind?
I mean, if it wasn't subsidized so much, then you would see wind operating as kind of a low marginal cost producer, right? And it might be able to, provide some cheap energy at certain times, right? But in Texas, wind is almost completely oppositely correlated to periods of high demand, right? In the summertime, the middle of the day in the summer is when the wind blows the least. And right after these cold fronts hit, when the temperatures get the coldest, right? When the front hits, the wind's blowing, right? The wind was actually blowing quite a bit Sunday night as the front was hitting. But by Monday, it was almost by late in the day on Monday, it was almost nothing, right? So when you have the periods of highest demand, those are the periods when wind is blowing the least, and is blowing the most when it's least needed, which is at night, primarily during the spring. So that's a fundamental problem. It's a fundamental physical problem that wind has in Texas. And
because
we don't have any kind of reliability standard for it, if we don't have anything, any requirement that wind be more correlated with generation, with demand, this is going to happen.
Yeah, because you can't bank that energy. You can't save it for later. I mean, that's not the way it works. That's not the way energy works.
I used to research batteries that did that, right? And that technology exists. We have technology to do that, but we don't have the scale for it. I mean, the scale that you need to do that at is enormous, right? And that goes kind of to the Green New Deal, right? The scale that you need to store significant amounts of wind and solar on a seasonal basis is astronomical, right? We have technologies that can do it, but the cost and the scale of it is just is unfathomable. And so, obviously, we haven't built any of that in Texas yet because we're not going to pay that much for it, right?
Yeah, I saw a recent study by Wood Mackenzie that said that we would have globally about 741,000 megawatt hours of battery storage for the entire world, right? That's about 1% of what Minnesota uses every year for electricity storage. And that's, I don't know, it's probably a quarter of what Texas does, right? So the idea that we're going to have some sort of magical battery storage that is going to be able to store electricity, because Brent, what would we need? Just rough estimate, napkin math, right? Would we need 15% of our electricity to be stored for seasonal stuff in order to make sure that we had enough electricity when wind and solar production was low? I know this is like a very complex thing. This is one of the most complex things that you can ask somebody. So it's probably unfair to ask you to give a rough percentage, but when would this be realistic?
Oh yeah. Well, I do study that a lot, right? That's kind of up my alley. So the estimates vary widely because it depends a lot on how much transmission you want to build, right? If you build a lot of interstate transmission across the country, you can reduce your storage needs. But the best estimates that we've seen are somewhere between a week and a month of energy storage for the entire United States, right? In Texas, we figure that we can get by with a little more than a day because we have pretty optimal wind and solar resources. And we can if we build enough of those, we can kind of match it such that we only need about a little more than a day worth of energy storage, which is still a huge amount. It's over 2 million megawatt hours, right? And we have, like you said, about a quarter of that installed currently in Texas, or currently in the world, right? In Texas, we have almost nothing. So it's that's just for a day, right? So if you're talking about more than a week for the entire country, I can't do the head math right now, but it's a large number.
You have to turn Oklahoma into one giant battery, apparently.
Yeah, batteries don't take up that much land, but yeah, you need about that much in area in terms of mining. That's for sure.
That's a good point.
Lithium mines are massive.
You brought up AOC, and she has been on Twitter kind of giving her reaction to all of this, and her take on it.
I'm glad I haven't been paying attention to that.
Oh God! Well, that's probably good for your mental state.
I've been too busy.
She's explaining. She's basically blaming all of this on not going forward with the Green New Deal. So is there any standing for any of that? Like is she just completely out on a limb, or is there any like room for her?
I'll try and turn her statement into something that she doesn't mean, but that is somewhat more credible. Okay. And I think what she's probably referring to there is that the government needs to mandate capacity to be built, right? And that's kind of what you're talking about with the Green New Deal, is the government is going to come in and say, we are going to build this much of X, Y, and Z, right? And so that's basically, I think that's basically what she's getting at, right? Well, and so in theory, that could solve the problem, right? Like you can mandate that enough capacity gets built, and in a certain sense, we do that in a lot of markets, right? We have capacity markets in other parts of the country, right, that pay generators to provide capacity, not just provide energy, right? In Texas, we don't pay generators except on the margins. We have some marginal programs that do pay for excess capacity, but by and large, we don't pay for capacity, right? We pay for generation, we pay for energy. And in some parts of the country, you do have capacity markets, right? Particularly in the Mid-Atlantic states and some others. I can't remember exactly how MISO works. Isaac can answer that question. If they have capacity, something of a capacity market there, but there's a really high cost. There's a cost to that, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you're going to do a Green New Deal style, you can imagine that the cost being just astronomical, right? I mean, in capacity markets that exist today, they work because you pay for a little bit of capacity, and that capacity is reliable and it does its job. Right.
Well, the Green New Deal wants to get rid of coal plants entirely, and they don't like nuke either, and they don't like natural gas. So if the Green New Deal was implemented fully across the United States as AOC, I guess we should have done this a decade ago. Your power, we wouldn't be having this podcast right now because you would still be in the dark, probably burning your furniture to keep warm at this point. So
we'd all have natural gas generators.
Yeah.
We'd all go out and buy generators.
Yeah. But yeah, there was a Babylon Bee story that said California residents who've moved to Texas finally feel at home now that rolling blackouts are the norm. So
yeah.
But the idea that all we needed was more Green New Deal that would have prevented what happened in Texas is just so crazy. I wonder if you could. And there's another argument I've saw out there. I think we should knock down some of these arguments. And one is that, hey, they got wind turbines in Antarctica and they work. And so the idea that wind turbines don't work in bad winter weather is a myth. I guess you just need to weatherize them using maybe a helicopter powered by fossil fuels, spraying things. So. Yeah.
Let's not be too, and that was like years ago, right? So let's not give the other side any easy, dominoes to push down.
Okay. Well, how do you get the ice off the wind turbines? You just wait till it gets to be 40 degrees and they melt over 3 days.
I would assume that's what they're going to do in Texas.
They don't have a choice, I guess. But this is what we're seeing in Texas, not the future of America if the Green New Deal is actually implemented, and Biden seems to want to do it by executive order these days.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is the future, right? I mean, if you're gonna rely on unreliable energy, then this is what's going to happen, right? And and we have between 20 and 30% on average across the year renewable wind and solar production, right? The Green New Energy asks for 100%, right? And these problems only get exponentially more difficult as you get beyond 30%, 40%, 50%, right? So we're seeing this at 20 to 30%. California's at about 30%. In Germany, they've made it up to 50% because they can rely on the rest of the European grid, and a lot of hydro in Norway and Sweden and whatnot. I mean, it's a fundamental physical problem, and you can't get around it. And the only way to get around it is to build a ton of capacity, a ton of batteries, and spend an enormous amount of money. I mean, trillions is just getting you started, right? So yeah, we can do that, but if we're going to pay for that, then we're going to impoverish ourselves in the process, right? And it's not going to happen.
It's like, it seems like these are compounding problems, like you were saying. Like when we go above 30%, 40%, it gets even more rickety. And then like you talk about like Biden's plan to have all of the federal fleet of vehicles like be electric powered. It's like, how are they going to go down and rescue people in places that are having blackouts and stuff like that if they can't even charge up their batteries in their cars? Like, it just seems like nonsense when you start putting these pieces together. I just don't get it. How AOC can come out and declare like some type of victory on this is ludicrous.
Yeah, I mean, it's the world we live in, right? I mean, we don't, you can say anything, right? And even in policy, you can claim almost anything, and what is there to refute it, right? I mean, we've been predicting that this was going to happen in Texas for a long time, but it was ignored because it hadn't happened. So she can come out and say whatever she wants about the Green New Deal because it hasn't happened yet.
Sure.
We get 4% of our energy from wind and solar, right? We get 4% of our total energy from wind and solar. So she can claim whatever she wants about it.
and she will.
And unfortunately, it's just the way it is.
Yeah. So I heard that, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but like Texas has its own specific electricity grid. And that's like codified in the Texas Constitution that they like have to do that.
Well, 90% of Texas does, right? So 90% of Texas operates under ERCOT. And it's kind of, I won't go into the history of it. I don't even know the history that well, but it's just kind of a quirk of history is the way the grid across the U.S. developed, that Texas has its own, 90% of Texas has its own grid. And then there's, kind of the Eastern interconnect and the Western interconnect that are the other two halves of the country, right? And so we do have connections to the other grids, but they're small. And then we also have, certain parts of Texas are in the MISO area, which actually extends all the way up to Minnesota, where Isaac is, and also covers you in Illinois. And then we have El Paso, which is in the western part of the state, right? El Paso, we always joke about how El Paso is not even Texas; it's so far out there.
Well, one of the parts of the Green New Deal is this idea of this like smart grid. And I've heard criticisms, and maybe they're unfounded, but criticisms of Texas in regards to this recent events and with the snowstorms, that because their electric grid is relatively isolated, that they aren't able to bring in energy from other regions of the world to kind of, or regions of the country to kind of fill this gap when there is a shortage of energy. Is there any truth to that claim?
Yeah, so you're going to see a lot of calls for more, and I've already seen it from some people that I know who work in the space. They're going to see more calls for more connections to other parts of the grid, right? And that's kind of the people that advocate for renewables. That's really what they push for, because it's kind of the lowest cost way. Storage is so expensive that the only really low cost way to get more wind and solar onto the grid is to build more transmission so that you basically spread it around, right? And so you have geographic diversity that accounts for some of the unreliability, right? But really what you're doing is you're just spreading the problem around, right? California and California is a great example, right? They have all this solar that they've built, and now they're cannibalizing reliable production from other parts of the Western grid, right? So there are other generators that used to supply power to California that are now shutting down because California's building all the solar. But then this summer when California had their blackouts and they needed that energy, it wasn't there, right? That's fundamentally why they had their blackouts. So we can build more transmission to other states, as California has done, and rely on those states. But you're basically just spreading the problem around.
It seems like you're socializing the cost of virtue signaling.
A little bit, yeah.
Are there any like overall kind of lessons that policy folks around the country should kind of glean from Texas's experience over the past several days?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, one of our advisors, Mike Nassy, there's a video of him on YouTube giving testimony in Indiana back in 2019, saying, "Hey, look at Texas as a cautionary tale. Indiana. I don't know exactly where Illinois is, but Indiana is about where Texas was 15 years ago in terms of wind penetration and deciding whether they want more or not. And so, yeah, there are a lot of lessons to be learned. I think first and foremost is that if you're going to have wind and solar on your grid, you need to have some kind of reliability standard for it, right? That wind and solar needs to have some kind of dispatchable energy available at peak times, right? So that's our proposal that we've been pushing and will continue to push, is that wind and solar should be required to pay for a certain amount of dispatchable capacity available during peak times in order to connect to the grid, right? So I think that's one lesson, right? Now the broader lesson. Now again, but that's really what that is a correction to a market distortion caused by subsidies, right? If you didn't have the subsidies driving this generation be added to the grid, then you would see a more natural balance of wind and solar providing energy on the margins when it is cheap, but then still having enough baseload capacity to reliable generation to meet the needs when demand is really high and wind and solar aren't producing a lot, right? So I think the first thing is that you need to get rid of the subsidies and stop that distortion. And second of all, you need to have a reliability standard for wind and solar, so that suppose wind and solar do get really cheap, right? And they are getting cheaper, right? But suppose they get cheap enough that you can get really high penetrations like this without subsidies, then they need to have some kind of reliability standard to pay for the cost that they impose on the grid, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because if not, you're giving them an indirect subsidy by socializing those costs.
Right. I'm wondering, you talk about the subsidies, and that's like a federal thing. Is there some like anti-subsidy that you can, some like fee specifically on, wind that counteracts, the subsidy at the federal level that could be installed at the state level? Or is that not free market?
Well, yeah, no, that's not very free marketing at all, for sure. I mean, it's not a comparative solution, right? I mean, even the solution that I just proposed, right, is not a free market solution, right? It's imposing a reliability requirement, right? But really, all it's doing is it's imposing the same reliability requirement on wind and solar that other generators already meet, right? So in a certain sense, yeah, it's not free marketing, but it's also fair, right? Imposing a tax is going a little further, right? Then you're just saying, well, we're just going to try and tax it so that we build less of it, right, and counteract the distortion that way. But then you're just creating a new tax, and that doesn't usually go over very well. So.
Right. Yeah. There'd be a lot of political campaigns, sloganeering about like taxing wind generation, our biggest growing energy source in Texas or something like that. I'm sure that would have its political consequences.
Well, that would screw the consumers on both ends, though. You're subsidizing them, and who pays for that? It's not human beings. We pay for that. Government subsidies are paid for by people. And then if you were to tax it to discourage it, we're going to get charged for that too. And so why don't you just let the market work? And if the market worked, I bet Isaac would agree with this. If the market worked, we would have negligible wind and solar in this country, because it's not a practical option for energy production on any kind of scale that works, because it's never there when it's needed, and it's there when it's not. It's like opening up a restaurant, but not having it open during meal times. You have all this food, and nobody wants it, or nobody's there to have it. But what do you think, Isaac?
I agree with that. I think that conservatives have long wanted to, show that we're open to wind and solar, but they're uniquely bad ways of generating electricity. And I think that we need to, cut it out with all the above, and we need to start saying all the stuff that actually works. And I don't know if you agree with this, Brent, but highlighting these shortfalls in a more articulate way, we should be winning this argument hands down. Like, this shouldn't even be close. This should be, walk-off home run for us. Hey, let's just build things that work all the time. And not build the things that don't show up when
Yeah,
we need it.
I thought like we won this when Michael Moore came out with his Planet of the Humans documentary. You know, like when Michael Moore is dunking on wind and solar, like why is anyone else even like carrying that torch anymore? You lost Michael Moore. Game's over. Like, come on, folks.
Yeah. Well, the problem is that we just, we've been kind of, and this is the problem that I think people like us have faced, is that a lot of these problems are in the future, right? Like
Yep.
we've been saying we're going to have reliability problems. We've been saying costs are going to go up, and they haven't yet, right? And so it's been hard to win those arguments. But the more and more that this happens, it's going to be more and more apparent to people the problems that exist, right? The thing that we're going to have to work with now is avoiding just more government subsidies and mandates to create solutions, right?
Yep.
We have to get people to say no. We're going to roll this back and get back to where we're letting the markets work instead of just trying to correct the problems that wind and solar bring with more government mandates, right? And
yeah,
I'm thinking government mandates for batteries, for backup generation, what have you, right?
Yeah, I think
that's the path that people are going to take this down. I guarantee it.
Yep.
Yeah, well, what's really just really insidious about the whole process of the way our energy economy has evolved over the last decade or two, is that it's not. To radicals like AOC and Joe Biden, to be honest, it's not enough to add wind and solar. You have to destroy reliable energy at the same time. You have to take coal-generated power off. You have to get rid of nuclear. And so this is where I think the problem happens. I think most people kind of fell asleep because in the beginning, it was just adding wind and solar. And now they're replacing wind and solar. And that is a huge, huge difference. And Texas is seeing what that difference really is. And it's rolling blackouts and people freezing. There's going to be people dead because of this.
Well, there already is. And the problem with this is the more wind and solar you add to the grid, the lower the wholesale price of electricity goes, right? So it's essentially product dumping. Let's say, China's making all kinds of cheap steel, they're subsidizing it, and they're dumping it into the American market in order to put our steel producers out of business. That's essentially what subsidies enable wind and solar producers to do. So even if we don't have any more regulations saying you need to shut down a coal plant or shut down a nuclear plant, more coal and nuclear plants are going to shut down if the Biden administration is able to install 60,000 new wind turbines and hundreds of thousands of new solar panels. There's a really interesting study by Lawrence Berkeley Labs that shows negative prices of electricity, instances where there's so much electricity that power plants need to pay people to use it. And these are always highly correlated with areas of high wind and solar penetration. And what that does is it forces coal and nuclear plants to pay people to take their power because they can't turn down the output quick enough. So you're essentially forcing these reliable baseload generators offline in order to accommodate more wind and solar. And to me, this is one of the biggest problems that we have with the system. Even if you take away the subsidies, you're going to be eating into their ability to operate properly because they have no marginal cost, which is cool, right? The wind and solar have no marginal cost, but they also have no ability to provide reliable service when you need it. So, there's a difference between cost and value, and the value that they provide is so much lower than that of anything that's dispatchable.
That pretty much nailed it, Isaac.
Yeah.
And Jim, you're absolutely right that that's it. That is the source of the problem in Texas. And Jim, you got it just right when you said that, this wasn't a problem until we started cannibalizing our reliable generators, right? If we were just adding a little bit of wind and solar on the margins, okay, fine. But the problems we're seeing now is fundamentally because that wind and solar has now started to cannibalize our reliable generation and cause that and cause us to not build any more reliable generation, right, on net. So that's why we are where we are, and we've been saying that we're going to get to this point for years, and we had to get to this point now for people to sit up and listen. Unfortunately,
yeah, I'll be very curious to see what happens in Texas over the next 6 to 9 months. Kind of what are the policy kind of ramifications of all of this? So, be very interested to kind of keep an eye on it. But we are running out of time. Brent Bennett, Policy Director for Life Powered, an initiative of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Thank you for being on with us. Where could people go to kind of stay up to date with all the work that you're doing?
Yeah, we have our website, lifepower.org. We have the Texas Public Policy's media website, the Canon Online, has a bunch of articles up there. You can also follow Life Powered on Twitter. Try and find our stuff, share it, please. It's hard to get the narrative out. I mean, when the papers and everything else are saying one narrative and they're not telling the whole story.
Yeah.
So please get that out.
All right. Awesome. Everyone, thank you for tuning in for this episode of the In the Tank podcast. Join us every Friday for a new episode. If you like our show, please subscribe. Write a review for us on iTunes. It'd be greatly appreciated. You could find us on pretty much everything nowadays: Stitcher, YouTube, Google, SoundCloud. If you'd like, you could follow us on Twitter, but don't. Go to Parler or something. If you'd like to send us your comments, suggestions, feel free to email us at inthetankpodcast@gmail.com. Jim, where can the fine people find you?
At Jay Lakely on Twitter, at Heartland Inst on Twitter. Always visit heartland.org. And Mega Dittos Rush Limbaugh, rest in peace.
Isaac Orr, same question. Where can the fine people find you?
Does Parler even exist?
It does. It just came back.
My app's not working. Follow me on socialist Twitter at the Fracking Guy.
All right. Thank you all for tuning in. We will talk to you next week.